really happy to see a pretty full room after an extraordinarily difficult couple of weeks in Los Angeles. I'm especially grateful to be in community with all of you. I'm Kara Horowitz. I'm the Executive Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. I know lots of you in the room. I'm pleased to join forces this week with the UCLA Canadian Studies Program. Woo! Go Canada! To host Catherine McKenna on campus this week as our distinguished visitor. So shout out to the Canadian Studies folks in the room. Catherine, as I think probably all of you know, served as Canada's Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, as well as its Minister of Infrastructure. She's also a former Member of Parliament. She remains deeply involved in efforts to shape climate policy internationally, nationally, and locally. Now from her post as founder and head of the Climate and Nature Solutions Group. So recently, Catherine served as chair of the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on net zero commitments of non-state entities, which released its Integrity Matters report, setting out criteria for making net zero commitments real. It's that report, among other things, that's going to serve as a foundation for our talk today. And she served in that expert group with our own Mary Nichols, Distinguished Counsel for the Emmett Institute, and of course, as all of you know, former chair of the California Air Resources Board, one of the world's leading climate change regulators. So there is I think it's not a stretch to say that there's a fair argument that these two women, Catherine and Mary, have done more to shape and push climate policy in North America than anyone else, bar none. So I'm incredibly pleased to have and honored to have them here in conversation today, especially this week. It's fair to say this is a hard moment for climate policy in the United States and globally. The winds seem to be blowing really hard in the wrong direction at the moment. And Catherine and Mary both know a thing or two about opposing difficult winds. Catherine served as the Environment Minister during the first Trump administration, and Mary then, of course, headed CARB. So I know they're going to share some lessons with all of us about doing this work in hard times, and I'm hoping they'll also share a little bit of hope with us today. So with that, I'm happy to welcome them to the stage. And they're going to organize this around a conversation between themselves. So I'm happy to put down the mic and just hand it over to you guys. You can clip your lapel pins to your lapels and go forth. Thank you so much.
I've done this 100 times, but
I really should know how to do this.
I know, like, how do I don't know. Okay, right. Alrighty, here we are.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited that Catherine accepted the invitation to come to the Emmett Center for this event. I'm excited because I was able to actually come up with a name of somebody from Canada that we could invite. I had one right at the ready.
Every year I'm available. I'm available every year in January.
In January, right. Climate means a lot of things, but one of the things it means is weather, and
Yeah.
sometimes we have the advantage there, for sure. So, so we're going to have a conversation and ask each other questions, and we agreed in advance that I got to start. So here goes. We titled this thing whether net zero pledges matter anymore, at a time when we didn't know quite how challenging that discussion was going to be. But we were already seeing that some corporations and some governments were backing away from pledges that they had made. So to start with sort of the big question, the net zero concept and the commission that you chaired, it was based on the fact that we had to make huge reductions in emissions and develop in the developing world in ways that are much less carbon intensive than what we had. But there was going to have to be some ability to get credit for work that wasn't necessarily being directly done by the government that was actually trying to meet their target. and that we could come up with some global system for assessing how people were doing on all of that. And I know that the Secretary General, when he asked you to head up the commission, was already very worried about whether those pledges were real, whether they were ever going to be achieved. So you're still doing this work. What's your assessment now?
Well, thanks, Mary, and it's really great to be here. And how's everyone doing? Are you all great? I mean, I'll tell you, I'm not always great in the climate, working in climate world. It's really hard. And I didn't know I would be coming because I thought I might be coming later because we saw the wildfires. So I imagine it's been really hard for many of you, whether you're directly impacted or know people are impacted or are just really worried. So it's okay to be worried. The one thing I need you to leave with is we're not giving up. And we're all gonna dig deeper and we're gonna do it together and it's gonna be okay. It's actually gonna be fun because solidarity actually with good people it actually makes you feel better. And that's why it's so awesome to be here with Mary, because I did come during Trump went to California, because I was like, oh, I'm trying to get a climate plan in Canada, and everyone's gonna say we got a competitiveness issue because the US is our biggest market. And we're not the 51st state, just in case anyone was wondering. We actually have a hat that says Canada is not for sale, so just if you need me to put on the hat, I will remind everyone here. Anyway, Mary and I, it was great to be able to come to California and demonstrate that Canada and the US are working together as allies and partners, even if at the federal level there's backing away from climate action, which we'll talk about more. So net zero, there's a lot to say about net zero. First of all, when I was minister, when we first made a commitment, a long-term commitment, and I did this actually with Brian Deese. So he was head of the National Economic Council under Obama, and in fact Trump had been elected, but it was at the COP, which I don't know why they would host COPs right after the US election. No one should ever do that. That's kind of a downer for sure. In that case, but we actually had we said that we would reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. No, 2100, sorry, 80% by 2100. And I'm telling you this because sometimes it's easy to say we're making no progress, no one's ambitious. Granted, we need to do a heck of a lot more to actually really reduce emissions, but it is important to recognize that the conversation at least has shifted, and that you're all studying here. There was when I was at law school at McGill, any Canadians here? No. What? We need more Canadians here. Gosh, if I were, a Canadian student, I'd want to come here, especially in January. But, yeah, I mean, we have made progress. The Paris Agreement is really important. For the first time, the world came together with a clear temperature goal, and then every country would do its part. So I want to it's easy to be everything sucks, it's all bad, we'll just give up now. So the reason net zero, that when the Secretary General, I'd left politics. And I just decided I wanted to commit my time to working on climate change globally, because that was my background, and it was working internationally, plus I had 3 teenagers. That was hard. So I had to also work on that project too. And so the Secretary General, he asked me would I chair this expert group on net zero. It was amazing. We had Mary Nichols, who was part of it. I said it had to be gender balanced or I wasn't going to do it. So we made sure it was, and we had an amazing group. And we had scientists, we had a former head of state, we had business leaders, we had environmentalists. So we had the former governor of the Bank of China. So it was a diverse group. And the goal really was there's a price of admission. So you can't just say you're net zero, hi, I'm net zero, and then that's it, see you later, which was what's happening. A lot of folks were I'm net zero. Not necessarily even a timeline, but generally people say 2050, but we're doing anything now, including oil and gas companies, financial institutions, corporates, cities and regions. And so the Secretary General said, we need to be clear about what's the price of emissions, so we want your working group to just set out the criteria and standards, and we also want to have that to call it greenwashing. Because greenwashing is very destructive. It makes people feel better that we're doing more than we're doing, but it also, I'm a competition antitrust lawyer, it also fools people. Like people actually often, a lot of people want to do right by the planet. They want to buy a product and they're like, I don't know, net zero baking. Is it really net zero? Probably not, right? So that's a problem. And so we did this expert report. It was called Integrity Matters. It got a lot of kudos because it was very clear. Like as I say to folks, like it may be hard to do, but it's not that hard to measure. Your emissions need to go down, and your money needs to go to clean at scale. And then there's other things you can do. You have to not do. You can't invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure. That wasn't our expert group. That's the International Energy Agency, and that's the IPCC. You can't lobby against climate action because then you're really not a leader on climate, which many folks, you have, I think your Chamber of Commerce is one of the leading offenders potentially in the
And
US.
that was one of the things that was most contentious in terms of the public response to our report. Was, where did that come from? What do you mean we can't lobby?
Well, I think you can lobby for positive climate action any day of the week if you want to say you're a climate leader, but if you're a climate leader, you gotta lead. And like I was the Minister of Environment and Climate Change to Canada, and so someone one day said, a former oil and gas CEO said, well, don't you want oil and gas companies to be part of the solution? And I said, yeah, I do, but they're not. And he said, well, you don't really know oil and gas. I was like, if you're the environment minister for 4 years in Canada, like you can write treaties on oil and gas, like oil and gas. And so the reality, there's just has to be rigor, and you guys are all here, you're law students or master's students or professors of law, you know that if you're gonna make a commitment, there are rules around your engagement. And so that's what we did. The challenge right now, and maybe the challenge even then, was I think there were a lot of people, so like me, I would say oil and gas companies, financial institutions in particular, who made commitments but thought they could just make a long-term commitment and then advertise that, and that would be it. And that includes in Canada, the oil sands through Pathways Alliance. So they were like, we're net zero. I was like, this is a joke. What? Well, you're not net zero. You're not, like, there's nothing net zero about you. And so by having the criteria and standards, like there was a complaint that even went to the Competition Bureau, which required, in the end, they just were like, okay, we're gonna stop advertising we're net zero because they weren't net zero. They took all their advertising down, all their website, their social media, and they said, that's because you're too aggressive. And I was like, no, truth in advertising is just a thing. So I think that there's been rigor to it, but the problem is I think some folks didn't really sign up to rigor. And so there has unfortunately been, in particular in the US and in Canada, you've seen banks, financial institutions pull out of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Does that mean net zero is dead? No. It means that if you're going to be net zero, you have to actually do the work. And we also, you can read our report. I feel like Mary and I did a good job because we're playing talkers and we had 10 recommendations. So I only work in three or 10, that's like my rule. And so we did 10 and our 10th recommendation, so 9 of them are what you must do or you can't do, and the 10th is we have to regulate. So it wasn't actually for non-state actors, it wasn't about what a financial institution, a corporate, a city or region has to do, it's what governments need to do. Ultimately, you have to regulate. Like, as much as we want people to do things because it's good, there's always going to be laggards, and if there are no penalties, it is very challenging. And so right now you see Europe is regulating net zero. So actually many corporates and financial institutions that are large in the US or in Canada are caught because of the threshold. So there is progress. I'm part of a net zero task force that's been established to look at net zero regulation. And I think sometimes there's just so much emphasis on North America, really the US, and then Europe, but you're actually seeing a lot of activity in this space in other places, in Japan, in Singapore, even in China. So there is more in South America, like there's more action that's going on, but it is particularly hard, and it isn't good when you have a president of the United States who denies climate change and then pushes everything in the opposite direction, including subsidizing the things we don't want, well, they're already making huge profits.
Well, it is. So let me push a little bit on the issue of what net zero actually is, because one of the things that was toughest for our group, and it was a UN commission, so we had representation from every corner of the world, literally, and we had from the left people who were anti-markets in general, no matter what they were going to be like. And we had people who were from the world of banking saying, we're never gonna make it without some form of crediting system where people can make money off of doing the right thing. And even if they might have been willing to accept the idea that there should be regulation of the market to make it work, they still were mostly pushing on what can we do to make these markets happen and be more efficient. And you had to bring all of that together, which I think you did an extremely fine job, because we got everybody to sign on to it in the end, and that was not easy, even with some of the staff that we were working with from the UN. But the question, I guess, that I would pose is, do you think that there's any more acceptance now of the usefulness of markets, whether regulated or not, than there was? You're still doing this work, right? I mean, you're still advising on.
For my sins. So, I mean, I think that the whole question of credits is really a complex question. So, it's funny. So when I was minister, I became minister. So I was elected in 2015 with Justin Trudeau, and appointed immediately to cabinet. And I went to Paris 3 days later. It was really a lot, because I was an environmentalist. I'd done human rights law, and I'd worked with indigenous communities on environmental issues, but I kind of had friends who went to the COPs, and I was like, those are the people that take care of climate. They go to like this COP land, and I actually had to ask my senior public servant, and I was like, there's no dumb questions, right? I was like, what's a COP? It was like Conference of the Parties, and I was like, that is the stupidest acronym and non-descriptive, so we're gonna ban acronyms here, because actually that's not helpful. And so I was working on Article 6, so I had to negotiate Article 6, which was particularly difficult, because even then it was even more extreme, because we had like, trying to think what country, Nicaragua, like they don't believe in markets. And so like they would just get very mad, and the Nicaraguan negotiator, I thought she was gonna throw a shoe at me. It was like 3 a.m. and it was like, she said, yeah, the Paris Agreement dies, it's all your fault. I was like, oh my God, like we're Canada, like that's not possible. We're trying to bring everything together. So the markets, it's a complicated question. I mean, it was very, like, so the rubber hits the road when you have a target, you have a long-term target, yes, but you have interim targets. And the question is, can you use credits towards your interim target? Not in addition to doing more work, like your target, obviously, you don't go down to zero immediately, you're on a pathway. So on this pathway, can you just use credits, or do you have to actually do real reductions? It's a very, very, very contentious issue with our group. Some people are like absolutely anti-credits. I mean, maybe in addition, although we put in addition, they were very mad. I was like, in addition, that's all we said. You can do like nature-based solutions that are credible and have integrity on top of doing your work. But then on the flip side, there were people like, well, of course you should be able to use credits towards your interim targets, because it's really hard and it's more efficient because they're cheaper. And so the thing about, like, California is a regulated market. Canada, so Quebec is in the cap and trade system with California, which is now, I guess you guys are trying to keep it together, so please,
moving forward,
just
yes.
keep on moving forward. And so I think regulated markets are very different. I am working with the government of Singapore. They have a carbon price, and 10% of the price you would pay can be used with credits, but they're working with countries to develop credits, like those high integrity credits. The problem is when people say carbon markets for voluntary carbon markets, like, is it really a market? It's kind of a free-for-all. Like, so a little bit, part of me is with the environmentalists. We're like, oh, well, if we did all the credits that everyone said they would do, even just nature-based solutions, we would cover the world 3 times. So I was like, okay, that's a problem, because we can't obviously do that. We're not going to tackle climate change just by credits and by pretending that we can, just plant trees in places. But I mean, I think there are opportunities in particular, and I don't, like, you can really go down, you can really go down very far in this, and then people can have very strong views. So we had to deal with everything, so credits was just one small part of our dealing with absolutely everything. Phasing out fossil fuels, no lobbying, what is an actual credible transition plan, and all the elements. So in 6 months, we were heroes, I felt like, in the UN system, like, to actually come up with stuff. So we didn't totally solve credits at all. And other people have worked on the integrity side. The reality is credits have to have integrity, both in terms of the use of credits and what is a credit. And if you really want to dive into this, and I'm sure many of you are like hardcore law students, so I see VCM, and I know I said I'd never use acronyms, but I actually can't remember. It's like the Integrity Council of Voluntary, it reminds you of that. And then VCMI, there are people who have worked on integrity, so you can go look at that. But I mean, I think that there may be situations like where if you're doing some like removals that you have to do at the end, because we're just gonna have to do some removals. So I don't really necessarily mean I don't mean carbon capture or storage removals for oil and gas, just so like parentheses. But if you're doing, you know, certain different removals where the technology is so expensive, like I think they would make credits probably make some sense there. I know developing countries, obviously I do a lot of work with developing countries, and they are trying, because they don't have money and we do not provide enough money, developed countries, they are looking at credits to, you know, for nature-based solutions to rehabilitate nature. So, I mean, I think there are certain cases where you do. It's just complicated, and in the end, integrity, a report was called Integrity Matters. The thing is the thing, so integrity has to be the thing, and we are not gonna get out of climate with credits. That is just a thing. I don't know if people can disagree with me, but that is just a thing. That's not how we're gonna get it. It could be something to help, you know, finance some solutions, and we need money. But I will, as you and I know, so we're probably close. We're pretty close, probably on this. Maybe like slight difference, right? Like a little bit of a nuance. The only thing I worry about with credit is there are people that are middlemen, women, things, entities, that are making money. And like, you know, the developing countries, first of all, often indigenous peoples are not consulted, or as people told me, they're planting trees that aren't even indigenous to the place they're doing, or whatever.
Wrong trees.
Right, that you know, are people making money? Like, some people are making money, like rich people are making money maybe, and but anyway, I mean, I think like everything in climate is quite complicated, but sometimes you always have to like remove the complexities. So lawyers, we can go down rabbit hole, like you're down in the bottom of the rabbit hole. The end of the day, climate change requires emissions to go down. It's just a thing. Like if your emissions aren't going down, we cannot beat this, and it is a largely fossil fuel climate crisis. And if you manage to keep that like always here, then sometimes the complexities become a little bit less complex. That doesn't mean the solutions don't require a whole bunch of ways you deal with things, but I think it is just important because you can often in climate, because it's an everything issue, kind of get slightly distracted from the real thing, that our emissions continue to go up. Our emissions continue to go up, that we continue to develop new fossil fuel infrastructure that is just not consistent with what we need to do, nor is consistent with the solutions we have, nor is consistent to all the things that we want, which is clean air, clean water, we want energy security, all these, we want, to compete. I say, when folks are like, well, US is gonna close, EVs, forget about EVs. I was like, oh, okay, well, you've just given the whole market to China. The whole world just handed over, right? And I'm Canadian, we have a supply chain on vehicles. So, I mean, I think that it is really important, like integrity does matter, and all of these things you have to make sure there's integrity, but at the highest level, we just have to actually be reducing our emissions.
So I remember a time being old enough and having been involved in the climate work for a long time when this idea of net zero pledges didn't even exist.
Yeah.
And I remember going in to brief Jerry Brown about this with the very brilliant person on my staff who was an economist who was explaining why it was better to have a net zero pledge than to try to keep on ratcheting the numbers, which was what we were doing before that in terms of percentage reduction over some baseline year, because it allowed for a greater chance that you would actually get the reductions, as you said at the beginning, because people would find more flexible ways to do it, including at least some use of credits or offsets or whatever, and they'd feel more comfortable beginning to move forward than they would have otherwise. So I would say Jerry Brown, and those of us who followed his career, I think will not be surprised here, was skeptical. He didn't immediately jump to the idea that this was a great alternative, and I bear some responsibility for having pushed him in this direction, partly because my staff was advocating for it, And partly because I myself was convinced that it would have appeal internationally, that we would never be able to negotiate our way through to numbers that everybody would agree to. Whereas if you had something that was more flexible in terms of how you measured it, then people would start work and they would begin the process. And as we know, emissions have not been going down generically, and they're not going down, period. But at the same time, I think both of us feel that there are things that have happened that actually are moving us in the right direction. That is, there are solutions that have emerged, like the success of electric vehicles, that do give you the sense that maybe we could actually get there. But I'm going to talk about that more, and I suspect when we get to opportunities for people to ask questions, there'll be more about this as well. But just in terms of the politics globally, when we see so much reactionary, so many countries in the world moving backwards. Now we're at the point where I think we're pinning our hopes on China, with the only place that we can really see has big emissions and is actually doing something about them, or appears to be doing something about them, and China at the very same time that the United States is, at least potentially going to into a very serious adversarial position with China. And that just, I guess, for you as a Canadian and as somebody who tended to work a lot of your work at the international level, that raises the question is there a viability for international agreements at all? Or do you see this, US, we're in Paris, we're out, we're in, we're out, as being just indicating that that there is no infrastructure that can allow us to really move forward in a global way?
So before I answer that, I'll tell a funny Jerry Brown story. It just made me think about it. So Governor Brown, I was like, I'm gonna meet this guy, he's amazing, but I've been told he's like very tough.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, I go in to meet him, and somehow we get talking. He studied to be a Jesuit priest. My uncle in Ireland was a Jesuit, so we had like some commonalities. And then he said, okay, well now we gotta talk real things. And he's like, the tar sands. And I said, well, in Canada, and like, I'm not defending them, by the way, I'm like the biggest critic, but I was like, we call them the US sands. And he's like, oh, I don't have a problem with tar. To be honest, I used to chew it. And I was like a kid. They would tar the streets, and I would take it into it. I was just like, what is going on here? Anyway, we became good friends. He was awesome. I'm just doing that because you all look really serious here, so we can't we have to also have some laughs.
We can tell a lot of Jerry Brown stories.
Look, I mean, we survived Trump 1. It was not fun, as I said. It was a hard time for me because I was like, I worked with the Obama administration. I was like negotiating kind of in Canada, and we have like a small island state. It's called Prince Edward Island, and we kind of have Saudi Arabia. It's called Alberta, and like I was like, oh my gosh, this is really hard. And I knew that there was a real possibility that some people in the business community, definitely oil and gas, did not want to move forward. So they would say, well, look, at Trump, we can't do this. And so I was like, okay, we have to have a strategy on this. So first of all, went to California. I was like, 5th largest economy. We're moving forward in electric vehicles and cap and trade, with California and Quebec. And I think we did air quality. Like, we just did a bunch of things. So that was good. But then we created the Ministerial on Climate Action. And this is quite funny. This just shows innovate in life. So I'd been minister for not that long. But I'm kind of plucky, and I really had to get a climate plan. So I got a little bit to know the Chinese negotiator, Minister Xia. And I knew the European negotiator was very flamboyant, and I also knew him, Miguel Quinete. But I was Canadian, just new minister. And I said, okay, we gotta have dinner. And they're like, okay, why? And I said, well, I just want to talk about an idea I have. And so anyway, we had a dinner, and I said, okay, we're creating this new thing. The major economies forum that the U.S. does, that's over. So we're going to create the Minister on Climate Action. It's going to be great. Canada, EU, China, we're going to bring the G20 together. And they kind of looked at me, and they're like, oh gosh, I don't know about this, because I think they were rightly worried about how would Trump react, and could we do this? And I was just like, we're doing it. We are doing it, folks. It's not a thing. The U.S. is not in. And they're saying that, we don't know. It's a reality TV show, but they're probably out. But it doesn't matter. They're not going to be leading on climate. And so we did it. We created this Ministry on Climate Action, and we met, and it was amazing. Now, the situation with China and geopolitics is much more complex But the reality is China is the largest emitter in the world and the second largest economy, so they need to be there on climate. And so the Minister on Climate Action continued for 4 years. In fact, one of the senior American, I won't say who, called me up and said, you can't do it. I was like, sorry, why can't we do this? They're like, because the US always does the major economies for them. And I was like, that's really funny, because I think you had an election. And so we're gonna have to do something. Like, the world is not gonna wait for the US for 4 years. We just did the Paris Agreement. So anyway, we managed to do this, and it still exists. So the Minister on Climate Action continues to exist. Why am I telling you this other than like innovate, and you can do it too? Like, you know, just come up with ideas. Like, I created an NGO because I felt like we needed supply and demand on lawyers in developing countries. It's called Canadian Lawyers Abroad. It morphed into Level Justice, which, because we started working with Indigenous communities in Canada, like, just do things and think outside the box, because sometimes in law I felt like it didn't always teach me to think outside the box. Really good lawyers think outside the box, and really good professors encourage you to do that, but sometimes you feel a little bit constrained by law, so do that, and kind of don't care what other people think, even if they think it's hilarious that you're trying to do this thing, because, you know, you're younger, or maybe you're a woman. I got attacked a lot because I was a woman in climate. It was called Climate Barbie, which sounds kind of cool now because of the Barbie movie. Because we had a feminist producer who made it cool, but I was not like, I didn't play with Barbie, so I didn't really like being called Climate Barbie. That wasn't really awesome.
You got way more bad stuff.
Yeah, that was like the least of it probably at the time, but at first I was like, why are they calling me Climate Barbie? But I think that internationally, so we got a really good question. I was in a class yesterday, like, the international rules-based order is kind of falling apart. Like, should we? No, we have to stay in. What are we talking about? Like, we cannot give up on, like, we are lawyers. We believe in rules and laws, and there are people who want us to give up on those. And that's what we've got. Like, of course we have the economy and we have the solutions, and that is certainly helping, but we need to have fora where people come together. And part of the reason for COPs, they make me crazy, I will say that. Like, I go, and I was at the last COP and I came back like super depressed from Azerbaijan. It was really annoying. We're in like a Petra state that's a massive human rights abuser. Like, that's not great.
Not a fun place. Anyway.
But it is where people have voices that don't have voices. Like, small island developing countries would not have a voice. They would not be able to demand money. Whether people step up and developing countries step up with the money is unclear. So to your question though, like, the US is like out again. We have seen this story before. It is less than ideal, but what are you gonna do, right? Like, I don't know, that's too bad for the US in a way. And it is too bad for a lot of people who wanna see the US there. And it makes it harder, but no one says it's gonna be easy. Like, tackling climate change is the hardest thing probably we have to do, because once again, it's an everything issue. We have to completely transform how we do things, how we think about things, and we gotta do it at Mach speed. But we have the solutions, and we have a climate crisis that is getting worse. It is in our face, and to be honest, the economics has to adapt or everyone's gonna go bankrupt. So all the financial institutions, all the insurance companies, all the reinsurance companies, all of these, like, even in Fort McMurray, where the oil sands were, it almost burned down. Like, no one can ignore this, and it's just too risky to our financial system. So sometimes I have massive issues with our financial system and how the incentives, but at the same time, in a way, those incentives will kick in. We have to get better at understanding risk. But I do think, like, we will get there. The question is, will we get there in the timeline we need to get there? But we cannot give up on existing institutions. That doesn't mean we don't innovate. That doesn't mean we don't do everything we can, in particular to bring regular people on side. As I've always said, I don't care why people care about climate change. I don't care. I don't care if they even call it climate change. As long as they want to do things that are good, that will move us forward. And by the way, when people are like, affordability, is it climate or affordability? I was like, what are you talking about? Climate is affordability. When you save energy efficiency, like Jimmy Carter, but also Ronald Reagan and others, like, they worked with conservatives in Canada, conservative politicians that we do not have anymore in Canada, but they believed in efficiency. They believe that there's a value to nature and the environment. And so I think we have to remember that and just keep on moving forward. But we do need to convince our friends, our neighbors, and it can be, you're at your church. I'm Catholic, sort of. Irish Catholic, I think. That's probably a better way of putting it.
It's a form of
But it is, well, it's kind of like cultural. But it is, I mean, I shouldn't joke, but anyway, the Pope has brought, he wrote Laudato Si. Laudato Si is climate is a social justice issue. People should care about poor people, and climate is a social justice, or it's an economic issue, or it's an innovation issue, or it's a jobs issue, national security issue. It doesn't matter why people care about it, but I think we gotta go to where people are. But as lawyers, I just ask, do not give up on the rules-based order, because what is your alternative? It's rule by power and force. That is not, like, we can go back to, like, you know, you probably studied the great powers, or like, you know, in your, maybe you did IR from a long time ago, like, is that where we want to go? I don't think so. So we just need to keep on being disciplined, and it will be hard, and some people will not obey, but we got to keep that system, and then we got to do everything else. We got to do Minnesota Climate Action. I do Women Leading on Climate. This is, like, Mary is one of the amazing women leading on climate. We're doing a campaign globally. Women are 2.5 times more likely to act on climate change. Women are 60% more likely to have a conversation with their friends and neighbors about climate change. If you have a woman on a board or in a senior executive position in a C-suite, they're more likely not only to push on climate change, but to disclose their emissions. So there's, like, different theories of change here. So go with whatever theory you know, can be, wherever you can have an impact. But we're all just gonna move forward, right? We're all moving forward here. We're just gonna move forward. Because I need you guys to move forward. I have 3 kids, so for them, like, that's why I do it.
So before I turn this over to the people who've come,
they're probably like, what is going on here?
What are you talking about? I did say that we could do this as a back and forth. So are there any questions that you would like to pose to me?
Well, I'm Canadian. And so I look at the U.S. and it's hard, right? Like, you know, I'm just like, what's going on here? And so maybe what's your case for the U.S. in climate action? And I've made a little bit of it because I do believe there is a case, but how are we going to move forward now, you know, that we're back in this situation, but I would say it's more dire than the first time around.
Yeah, so yes, I was at a gathering 2 weeks ago, I guess, back east, of major organizations that are advocates for climate action, talking about what to do next, and they had a bunch of foundations there with them. And we all, you know, basically the group came to the conclusion, not too surprisingly, that we gotta keep on doing what we've been doing up until now, and do it better and smarter, and you know, focus on some specific priorities, which we could talk about. But one of the people who was there was the head of the organization called Ceres, which focuses exclusively really on getting commitments from businesses and from the economic sector about climate. And Mindy Luber, who's the founder and head of that organization, was saying that in contrast with the beginning of Trump 1, when she was able, with just a few phone calls, to get, I think it was 500 major corporations to sign a letter that was published in the New York Times, basically saying, we're still committed, we're still in. And you had people just jumping, you know, to get out in front and make it very clear that backsliding was not going to go back. This time, she did the same thing, and she got 5 companies that would agree to put their names forward as being willing to stand by their previous commitments about climate. She wasn't giving up either. But it does point to the fact that even very large corporations, which by the way are not going to change. I mean, people have said privately in many meetings, oh yeah, we have our plans. We make our plans 5 years in advance. We know what we're investing in. We're not giving up on, and this is including people from the auto industry as well as the energy industry and others. They know they have to keep on because they do actually understand the reality that their future is dependent on dealing with the climate issues in one way or another, and yet they're still afraid to speak up. So we are in a situation where, at least for the moment, many people that you would think would be pretty immune to threats coming from the man that was just inaugurated, I think it was yesterday. You know, they're still waiting, biding their time, to see what's gonna happen. Where is their moment gonna come? It was also pretty remarkable that the same day, I think this has happened once or maybe twice before, the same day that we were swearing in this president was
It
also
was actually, I think
Martin-
Monday, but it just feels like it's
You're
like
right,
every day,
forever,
it's just like, it
forever,
just
forever.
continues and continues,
Yeah, thank you. That it was also the day that we celebrate the birthday of Martin Luther King. And that you couldn't ask for a worse kind of juxtaposition in some ways. But I was listening, of course, because I was refusing to listen to any of the coverage of what was happening in Washington. So I was listening to other programming around the Martin Luther King holiday and around what's happening, you know, with the issues that he fought about, many of which, by the way, are still the same issues, even though climate change wasn't on the agenda. But certainly justice and environmental justice, and the fate of other countries and our responsibility for what's happening in the world and the rise of oligarchs and economic, you know, inequality, which just, you know, we're all really front and center all that time. One of the things that kept coming up in different places is hope. You know, what gives you hope, or do you have hope, or why would you have, how can you have hope? And one of the best things that I saw was a quote from Václav Havel on the topic of hope. He was such a great writer, but he said something to the effect that hope is not something that you just have because it seems like you're going to win. That's in fact the opposite of what it is. That it is what makes you get up and keep working, even when you know it's a long way off, or you're not sure that you're going to win at all. But it's a quality that you have as it's a quality of character, basically, of how you live your life. If you choose to be a person of hope that keeps working on the topics. I think it's another way of saying what you were saying before, but what's interesting is that I think that there are people in the business world, in all sectors certainly, who understand that they are going to be judged by what they did during these times, and that for better or for worse, at least, many of them are going to find a way to do it, but they may not be the first. They may not be the ones who are speaking up until it becomes a little safer or a little more fashionable to do that. So that's, I mean, I'm ashamed for my country in many ways right now, but probably more so about some of the horrible things that we're doing about immigrants and the horrible things we're doing about people who are trans, than I am about the climate issue, because the climate issue it's fundamentally about economics, really. I mean, of course there's a moral dimension to it, for sure, but there's also the fact that it's already pretty clear that we're literally gonna burn up if we don't take action. So in that sense, I guess part of me says, okay, people will be rational, at least to some extent. All right, enough. I think we should.
Now let's hear from students and faculty and anyone who wants to ask a question.
Yeah. Should we call up people? Or maybe Kara, you do it, because then I don't have to.
Sure. David.
I'm David Nealon, professor over in atmospheric oceanic sciences, also member of the board for the Canadian Studies program.
I have a hearing problem. I'm sorry, so I'm going to ask you to speak up or come forward.
Yeah.
Are you Canadian?
He is Canadian.
Where are you from?
I'm originally from Ottawa.
Oh my God, like, what's this Ottawa thing? Okay, all right. Did you live down the street from me? No, I just keep on finding people that like lived around the corner. It's weird.
In the Glebe.
In the Glebe? Okay, I live in the Glebe. Okay, anyway, that's enough for the non-Canadians. You're welcome to come visit.
I teach a course on climate change assessment and have for many years. And one of the things that I'm faced with now in the course is what, you want to, in addition to the students being shocked to learn that we've known everything since the China report in 1979 and all the times in between. You want to channel this towards something positive, more than just hope, but there's a lot of energy and a lot of capability. The NGO and startup sectors, they seem scattered in face of such a large problem. You can say, all right, you've done right by living in California, but that's a beginning. Is there a path that we could be recommending for our students that levels up the activities in private sector, in, you were mentioning a Ministry of Climate Action. Is there some way to create an umbrella or get our students going to at least some of the larger groups that are more likely to have impact, like suggestions for what you would put on the desk of students who want to do something that's the highest impact, highest priority?
So, I mean, this will be an unsatisfactory answer, but I went to law school. I didn't know what the heck I was going to do. Wanted to make a difference, but then I had to pay the bills, so I went to big law. I hated it, but actually, to be honest, when I became Minister of Environment and Climate Change and I had to sit in front of oil and gas companies and they were telling me things that weren't true, I didn't care. I literally said that is not true. And so, and I also understood our Bay Street, your Wall Street, and incentives. So I'm not saying, like, because I know, first of all, we have to be realistic. I'm sure a lot of you are going to have some debt. School's expensive, maybe less expensive here than some other places, but I don't want, I feel like journeys are gonna go in different ways. And so I had a very, like, you can read my CV and you'll be like, oh, of course, that's exactly how I was gonna go. Like, that is so weird. Like, I started my legal, I wrote my New York bar because my partner at the time was a diplomat and I went to Indonesia and then worked in oil and gas. Can you imagine oil and gas, me? And then I ended up, and it was when Suharto fell, so then I did some work on democracy and then I had the opportunity to go work with the UN on East Timor, renegotiating a treaty governing offshore petroleum development and maritime boundaries for East Timor so that we could fight oil and gas companies and get money for them on oil and gas royalties. And then I came back to Canada. I went back to big law, hated it, but I was a competition and antitrust lawyer, so all these kind of BS things that are happening, which are scaring companies now. I'm now working and fighting them and doing competition. Our Competition Act has misleading advertising provisions, so I'm able to use them to go against oil and gas greenwashing. And then I started a charity called Canadian Lawyers Abroad because I saw in East Timor there were no Indigenous lawyers when we were trying to fight with oil and gas companies. And I knew there were lawyers in big law that were bored and would like to do something that they felt had more meaning. So then we did this, and then I ended up in running it for office because I realized that working outside the system wasn't work. So I just want to say that because I think life doesn't always go in a particular way. I will say this because I think it's important that when I was in law school, I was like, I mean, you can see it, like I'm high energy. And I'm like I'm kind of type A, but I also really want to make a difference. So maybe a type A who wants to make a difference, who also just likes having fun. And I ended up in big law and I hated it. But I felt like that's what I was expected to do. And so and then leaving law was like this tragic thing. I was like, oh my God, I'm leaving law. And then one day I was like, why do I care? Like, I'm still I did law school. It doesn't mean that I'm not. So I think that, I do hope that people who care about the environment use your skills in a whole variety of ways. For sure, environmental organizations there are some really good ones. NDRC, but there's I could just list a whole bunch of them, but not everyone's going to end up doing that, and you may not be able to afford to do that, or you might have sick parents, or you may have a partner going to Indonesia. I don't know what your circumstances are going to be. You may actually not even be from these states. You may be from, Africa and you should go home and maybe do some things there, or maybe not, maybe work internationally. But I think what you have to do, because climate is an everything issue, and you are the elites. So you may not always feel like elites, like in first year law, you might be like, I'm just trying to figure out how to survive here. But you are the elite, because you are an elite law school. I don't care what your circumstances are, you may have come from dire poverty, wherever, you are an elite, and so now you are given very special skills. So because climate is an everything issue, the good news is wherever you go, you can make a difference. Or sometimes you may feel like you're working for the bad guy. Just extract all the information you can about what they do and then go sue their ass off later on. I don't care. Like, we do need people who do that, right? Like, that is important. And so there is no easy answer, but the good news is because climate's an everything issue, like we need people to go into and use law and engineering and go, figure out the new solutions. We need people actually to go sue oil and gas companies who use their legal skills. We need people to go become scientists. And so there's so many ways to make a difference, and I don't want to limit people because you're gonna come with different backgrounds and different skills, both like hard skills, but also soft skills. Like, I don't know. And so that may be an unsatisfactory answer. I just want everyone to make a difference, and I want you to wake up some days, and you may have a crappy job. I've had crappy jobs in my life. Like, I'm like, why am I doing this? And I was like, oh, because I had to make money. I was working building my charity on the side and, doing, just in-house counsel, which I didn't love, but it allowed me to do this. Plus I had kids, so I don't know, I was trying to, make things work. Just always think about how you can make a difference. It's really important. Look at what are the other opportunities, and some of it will be outside of your work. If you have to, you have a job that maybe you need to make some money, you can do things outside. You can work. Also, it doesn't have to be directly related. Environmental justice. Justice is justice is justice. It is all related, and the skills you get, or the connections you make, or the difference you make will make you feel good, and it will convince you to continue to do more. So there's no linear path. The one thing I want everyone to think about is politics matters. Like, it's not easy. It was not easy when I was in politics. I mean, at the beginning, actually, it was quite amazing. I could have, went to the Paris Agreement. I said, Canada's back. Everyone cheered, so I should have retired. It was awesome. But then, it got less and less and less easier. And so, less easy. I went to French school, so sometimes but I think, when you look at what really makes a difference, this election was really consequential. It was. Elections matter. Local elections matter. State elections matter. Federal elections matter. And so whether you run, and I know it's hard because actually it's really expensive here to run. That is a big barrier. But organizing, knocking on doors, engaging is really important wherever you're from. It matters because it's so consequential. I look in Canada, I'm like, oh my gosh, we could lose absolutely everything we did on climate. I will just be so disappointed, which is why I'm engaged again. I was like, I'm done, and now I'm helping, one of the candidates who's running for Liberal leader. But I do think it is really important. So you can do that, as the one thing I would say, do consider supporting politics, engaging in politics if you care, because that is the one thing, getting to rules-based order and all these things, if it really makes a difference. But you can make differences, and I have no doubt you will all make differences in all your different ways. But there are great organizations that are out there that I've worked with that you can go to, but you can also make differences in little ways. And there are a lot of little organizations that really need help. You could do pro bono work for them, but it doesn't even have to be legal work. You can just help them, right? Because you're smart and you have chutzpah, you probably have connections, you can probably help in different ways. And so, I don't know, now I feel like I'm giving a treatise, but my life, when people, I just feel like people are yeah, how do I get to the position? So I remember looking at people that were, successful, and I was like, how, my gosh, am I gonna get from, it's Hamilton, Steel Town, how am I gonna get there? And everyone's gonna have your own journey, but just focus on what matters. And climate is the thing, so you can make a difference on climate in so many ways, even if it's just talking, if you go to a church group or your neighbor. Those things, those conversations really matter, and you can have really big impact, but you have to be thoughtful about it. And that may not be in your day job. As I say, you may be working for the bad guys, so just leave that, and then, as I say, extract the information and then go after them later. But just think about how you can make a difference.
So can I just add one thought to that before we turn to the next person who has a hand up? And that is to say that I used to always give something close to that answer, particularly always ending up with vote, you gotta vote. Well, speaking for myself, I do, and it worked out really badly. This did not actually, did not prove gratifying, let's put it that way. And I know a lot of other people feel the same way, although many do not, and I'm sure there are people on this campus and maybe in this room who are happy with the results of the election. But I am quite angry in many ways about how we got to that point where what happened, and lots of people to blame, and not everybody is all, not everybody is from the winning side who had anything to do with this bad result. It doesn't make me want to give up. I'm actually very proud of having worked on a couple of congressional races where we were able to hold or flip seats in the House that really mattered and will matter in 2 years when the next set of congressional elections come along, and where we have I think a very good chance of winning back the House again on the side of doing something positive. But right now, things are pretty bleak in that world for sure. There is, though, I think, just to add another dimension onto the politics side of things. The reality is that those of us who've worked at the federal or state or local or international level always have a tendency to sort of look at this in a top-down way and think we need the UN to be acting, we need the global agreement, we've got to have the country, we've got to have climate legislation, real federal climate legislation, and then it sort of moves down. I think the reality is that we've always gone the opposite way, that change comes from the people up and not the other way around, especially in a democracy. And even people who voted for what I would consider to be ridiculous reasons and voted the wrong way actually can be made to be supporters, can be induced to be supporters of some of the things that we know actually do make a difference, like in California, the policies that have kept us moving forward sort of at the forefront of things. So I think it's important to make the pitch that we really need to be focused on changing hearts and minds in constructive ways, and that can be done either through local politicians, or very often those people are going to turn to places like UCLA to ask, what can we do? And they actually need the solutions, because they don't know everything that you know, and not that we know everything that we should know, but we at least know more about what could be done that would actually make a difference in terms of really reducing the risk of fires, reducing emissions in the future, and they need people to hand them that stuff in a easily digestible form, because they don't have the time to read very much, because they're too busy like running for office and raising money to run for office. So I kind of want to go back to that point that being in a university doesn't mean that you're cut off from having a relevant role as somebody in the university. There are things that are already going on here that could be done more of, that could be exported better, could be communicated better. We undoubtedly need better vehicles for communicating through, because mainstream media is not the way to do that. We sort of know that now. But anyway, just to add on to it, it's an addendum to what you said, and we should give somebody else a chance to ask it.
Thanks. I'm hoping to get 2 more questions, and I'd actually love to get the next one from a student, if there's a student who has a question. Okay, great. Sorry, Marley, but
We can be shorter
We'll
on our
try.
answers.
Yeah.
Well, we will be sure. If there are other students too.
Hi, my name is Narayan Gopinathan. I'm a PhD student in sustainability. I've long been a fan. I'm also a dual citizen of Canada. I did my master's there, and so I've long been a fan of everything that both of you have done on carbon pricing here in California and Canada. And so I'm actually researching phase-out policies, so I'm going to ask you both for interviews later. But
Nice. That was tricky.
Now I want to ask about the future of the Pan-Canadian framework, because I've long been a fan of what you did in terms of carbon pricing and the Towering Pass Coal Alliance, but as you know, the politics are really tricky right now with carbon pricing. And so what do you think is likely to happen, or how do you foresee what might
That's a long answer. So So in Canada, we have a direct price, so it is a price that includes, it'll be at the pump, but it's revenue neutral, i.e. all the money goes back, such that it's a progressive policy in that most people get more money back than they pay. The problem with it, and then we also have an output-based pricing system, so heavy emitters, they are dealt with separately. But the direct price we have had, like, since, this is why I was fighting to the death. Like, it was on other things, we were doing coal phase, we were doing a bunch of things, so that was like, there was a bunch, but it was pricing that became the big fight. And it was actually George Shultz, he's passed away, but he was a Republican politician, he was Secretary of State, I think he was in the Nixon administration and in the George Bush senior administration, and he was like, you gotta do revenue neutral carbon, you gotta give all the money back, do it transparently, it'll be all great. So you would think that's it. Well, right now it is under dire threat because we had right-wing conservative politicians who every single day, that's all they did, axe the tax. They just talked about how a revenue neutral carbon, like where all the money goes back, where people are better off, they get more money than they pay, was actually an affordability crisis. And this is too long for me. It's actually like literally got a bit of PTSD on this one because it is definitely, it's been a fight and I cannot believe we could potentially lose it. We wanted the Supreme Court, we won through 2 elections, but it's still a risk and it just shows the fight never ends, by the way, folks, never ends. Doesn't matter what it is, if it's on, it's, Martin Luther King's fight or it's a fight for the LGBTQ community or it's the fight for justice in any form, it just never ends. But it is at risk because people lied and there was misinformation and every single day they spent tons of money, taxpayer dollars to advertise against it. And I don't think we were effective as progressives to really defend it. And it is very irritating to me because I was like, oh, this just makes sense and we're actually gonna get rid of policy which is gonna hurt people in an affordability crisis. But I don't know what to say, hard things are hard and that was really hard and you have to constantly be out there pushing it and protecting it, and unfortunately it is definitely at risk, which is very sad to me personally, but it's also stupid because it actually works and it actually gives people money back and like it's the most effective, most efficient, cost-effective policy you have, but I don't know. Okay, we should take, are there a couple more students, like if they want to go really fast, I feel bad, like we talked.
Do we have another student with a question?
Okay, good. Yep. You guys you're all done. Okay.
Okay.
So, like, we gotta go. We gotta go.
Okay.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for sharing your experience. Both of you. I'm French, so I don't know if it counts. I'm not Canadian. But, so I have a question. So I'm a professor here at the Anderson School of Management and the Institute of the Environment, and I was just wondering what your take is about climate adaptation. We talked a lot about mitigation. But with the, kind of climate strategy that we all just, experienced here, I feel like there is just much more, kind of action now, especially from lawyers actually, in trying to get, our electric utilities to kind of, get better prepared. And so what do you think, and it seems like, in the current, political environment, this might be an area where we can make more progress. So I wanted to ask your take on that.
Rebuilding, it would be a terrible shame if we didn't use the necessity of rebuilding the areas that burned out as an opportunity to demonstrate some better ways of building, construction, locating things, better infrastructure that's more friendly to climate, and try to solve for both things at the same time. I mean, it's been years now since it's been sort of obvious that you can't have mitigation without adaptation, and vice versa. That we can't address the problems that we already are seeing without doing something to prevent it from getting worse. So I think it's almost like we need to abolish that kind of dichotomy and that kind of terminology in favor of just a more general approach to living with the climate that we have and the risks that it presents. There are areas that I was talking with Catherine earlier today about the fact that everybody needs to understand risk better, because risk translates into investment, it translates into decisions that people make about insurance. There was a very good piece just the other day about what's happening with the question of insurance. If everybody's underinsured because the insurance companies can't afford to pay out on the level of damage that's already occurred, and they're canceling the ability to get new insurance, what does that mean? Either everything burns down and there's no way to rebuild, or the costs get socialized, and in our current world of very non-progressive taxation, you know, what that ends up meaning is the people who can least afford it probably end up paying a much larger share of the cost than the very wealthy people who are refusing to pay their share. So people who know more about insurance than I do are going to have to try to figure out how we tackle that question, and that's just one piece of it, but it's absolutely critical piece of any kind of approach to living with the climate change that we already have.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird because it is true that adaptation is the poor cousin to mitigation, that like all the attention and, you know, goes to mitigation. We have to adapt. The challenge is that it does go back to risk, because adaptation costs money, and you often can't, like, people are always like, how do we scale private finance? Like, it's less sexy and less easy to do, and governments and businesses have to better factor in risk. Like central banks, everyone, like if we did that, then we would be like, oh, given the models of where we could be in, you know, 10, 20, 30 years, because we're building infrastructure. I was Minister of Infrastructure, your projects are so far out, and we're not building in a way that reflects where we are going to be, assuming different models, but we're not, you know, on any pathway where we're going to stop climate change anytime soon. So I totally agree with you, and the rubber's gonna hit the road here, right? Like, rebuilding here, you can't rebuild the same way. That is just true, and it was an interesting article I saw today. It was about gas pipelines, and I don't know if anyone saw the article. They were like, oh, now we got to deal with like the fact that fossil fuel infrastructure is actually now coming up, and we're seeing all these pipes, and how are we going to manage all that? So everyone's going to have to be way smart about it. But utilities, to be fair to utilities, most of them, you know, they don't necessarily, if they don't have masters like governments and others who are actually, you know, really understanding risk and where we're going to be, then they're always going to be under investing because they won't have enough money. And as you say, it comes back to who's going to pay. It's going to be the public. Like, at the end of the day, it's always the public that pays, because, you know, companies can go out of business, insurers can go out of business, and then it comes here. But we have to do a much better job in adaptation. But as we all saw, you saw Spain and you saw China on those images of cars going down streets and like just getting pushed. Like, we have not built in any way an environment that can withstand just even the impacts of climate change right now, let alone in the future. So we're going to have to do a lot better, but that's going to require a lot of money, and it's going to have to understand what is the modeling to understand. Like, when I was infrastructure, like one last thing, I was infrastructure minister, and we were so excited, like in my little Hamilton, Ottawa Center, so my riding, whatever you call it here, but my district or something. And they were so excited because we had new wastewater tunnel. They were so excited. And then like 10 days later, we had a storm and the wastewater tunnel couldn't actually handle the rains. I was like, oh, that's really amazing. We just built this. Oh, it's great. So yeah, we're gonna have to do better.
Okay, thanks. We have 2.5 more minutes, I think. Final words as we sally forth to the next 2 to 4 years in U.S. climate policy. You want to set us off on the right path?
Like, look, I mean, back to hard things are hard. And my dad's, I was thinking this because I was feeling really sorry for myself, as lying awake at night, as I often do, worrying. And I just like was feeling, you know, like, oh man. And I was thinking, my dad, he passed away, but he was Irish, and he said he would have said to me, hard things are hard. So like, it's not gonna be easy. You're just gonna have to put your head down and do the work, but be hopeful, because you have no choice. We have no choice to be hopeful. Like, what are you gonna do? I'm like, I am a realistic optimist, or some days I'm an optimistic realist, but I have 3 kids, so I'm gonna get up every day, I'm gonna do the work. But my dad would have also said, have fun. Like, be with people you like, and you doesn't always have to be so heavy. And I know it feels sometimes really heavy, and I worry about young people because you've always had to grow up with climate change is in the back of your minds. But have fun. Like, life is short too, and do things that are meaningful with people you like. And that has really given me hope. Like, I was with we created Women Leading in Climate, and I will tell you, and we were all very, very pissed off in Azerbaijan. It was like all these women I had never met, like everyone was coming to this event. They were really mad about women's rights too. It wasn't just about climate, but we were like, we are going forward, and you suddenly felt stronger. And I knew many of those people would be alone in the boardroom. They'd be the only woman speaking up. They'd be alone in the negotiating room. They'd be alone in the class. We all felt some solidarity, and solidarity is so important, but it gives you hope and it gives you strength. And we will win. We will win. We just have to really dig deep right now, and it's hard.
Yeah, keep on pushing.
All right, thanks. Seems like a great place to leave it. Thank you so much, both of you.